I'd like to welcome you to the presidential session titled The White House Initiatives on Educational Excellence for Diverse Groups. I am Linda Tillman, and I will be moderating our panel and interactive discussion today. I would first like to introduce Dr. James Miner, who is from the Department of Education. He will introduce our panelists. After his introduction, each one of our panelists will give a description of the initiative that they are working on. We will then have remarks from our discussants, Dr. Miner and Dr. James Earl Davis from Temple University, and then we will open the session up for questions and comments from the audience to our panelists.
Thank you, Linda. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, there was a session before this one, so you all should be awake. I'm James Miner. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and I am going to introduce our panelists, which will focus on the White House initiatives. The theme of this year's conference, as most of you know by now, is Towards Justice. The focus of this session is the role each White House initiative plays in shaping public policy and advancing outcomes for various communities of color. Linda Tillman, as she mentioned, will serve as the moderator. I'm going to be a discussant together with James Earl Davis. So I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists who will each offer 5 minutes of opening remarks. I have reminded each of them that this has been billed as a town hall meeting, and I did see microphones in the audience, and I'm sure that by now most of you have sat through enough sessions without enough time at the end for questions and answers, so we will try very hard not to do that. We want to have a vibrant discussion about the work of each initiative. The purpose of this session is not to take up less related policy issues that may or may not be related to the work of the initiatives. For those of you who may have questions or initiatives or policy positions of the department that you may or may not be so happy about, I can meet you in the corner or in the lobby to talk, to argue, to arm wrestle, but we want to focus our time and attention in this session on the work of the initiatives. We'll try to stop, I think, a little before the end of the session to give our panelists a few minutes to offer any closing remarks. So what I want to do now is just quickly introduce our panelists in the order in which they will come up. First is Kalila Harris, who sits here to my immediate left, is the Deputy Director for the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. Kalila is a power in the department. She is a force to be reckoned with. She is an attorney by training, but has been a very active educational leader in the Baltimore area for more than a decade. Next, we will hear from Alfredo Artiles, who is no stranger to AERA. He's an Associate Dean and the Ryan Harris Professor of Special Education at Arizona State University. He's a commissioner for the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. Next is J.D. Mailer to my immediate right, who is a former CEO of Kamehameha Schools. She is part of the President's Advisory Commission on Asian American and Pacific Islanders, the White House initiative that focuses on activities for that constituent group. Following her will be my colleague Bill Mendoza, who is the Executive Director for the White House Initiative on American Indian and Alaskan Native Education. Bill himself is a former teacher and principal. Following Bill will be Ivory Tolson, who most of you know as an associate professor at Howard University, the editor of the Journal of Negro Education, CNN, NPR, commentator and resident expert on the education of African American males. Ivory is the deputy director for the White House Initiative on HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities. So that's our panel. The two discussants, myself and James Earl Davis, who was an all-world professor at Temple University. So having said that, Linda, I'm going to ask the panelists to come in that order, and then Linda Tillman will come after their opening remarks to moderate the discussion. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Teacher voice, cafeteria voice. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans, a title which in every situation we always say in total, because all too often excellence is not associated with African American scholars. So if you want an abbreviation of our initiative, I'm going to share with you that it's the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans, all right? So our initiative is the youngest of the 5 White House initiatives established by President Barack Obama during his administration. We are charged with ensuring there is two-way communication between communities around what policies and practices they would like to see determining the outcomes for their children, and also what policies and practices the federal government has in mind based on communication from them. So our initiative is charged with ensuring that we are out and about around the country communicating with citizens about what they like about our policies, what they don't like, what recommendations they have, what promising practices are happening in their neighborhoods at the local level, at the state level, and also that they're seeing across the country themselves. One key way that we do this is by providing platforms for youth to make recommendations about what they need to feel safe, engaged, and successful. All too often we have discussions where we are talking about young people or we are talking about educators, and they are not centered in the discussion because they're not a part of the discussion, right? We're talking about them, or we might bring them in to do a dance or do a performance of their work, but they're not actually engaged as an equal partner in the discussion. And so our summits that we've been hosting around the country have had a series of panels where the experts on the panels are young people. And it's important for us to hear their voices because their lived experiences should inform the work that we do, both at the local level and at the federal level. We also disseminate information about and evidence of people, programs, and practices that are accelerating the learning and development of African American students. Again, we move around the country also observing for promising practices, either through listening sessions, roundtable discussions, or as invited guests of programs and communities who want to share something that may not bubble up as a result of being noticed by people of privilege, right? There are lots of people doing great things in their communities that may not be affiliated with a national organization that has million-dollar lobbyists to give them a seat at the table with the federal government. So we find it important to position ourselves in communities where we can listen. Sure, we may have a 1-hour session where there's a photo op and media opportunity, but we like to spend a couple of days in different communities where we can both learn what's happening in the public presentation and then have a side conversation with a young person and ask them whether or not they really feel like they go to a safe school, or this program is really effective, or their parents are actually engaged, or they've been incarcerated and the schooling inside of their justice facility has provided them the same quality of education as the one outside of the facility. So our initiative focuses from cradle to career and beyond. The other initiatives have different charges in their executive orders, but it is critical for us to ensure that we're providing platforms and spaces for there to be two-way communication between communities that you live in and also the community of the federal government and all of the agencies that are working to support citizens. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I serve on the commission, the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. And I'll be glad to provide a little more information about the work we have been doing for the last few years. I'm just going to highlight a few general aspects of the work that we're doing, including some historical information. The commission was created in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush, and it's been renewed subsequently by Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And the impetus of the commission has been to address educational equities that the Hispanic community has faced historically and continues to face to this day. We are concerned with advancing strategic policy and outreach an agenda that tackle some of these challenges. We're concerned with providing information and improving the availability of and access to high-quality early learning programs, increase the number of Hispanic high school graduates, and ensuring more Hispanic students enroll in and complete college. Dr. Eduardo Padron is the chair of the commission, who is the president of Miami-Dade College. We have a very interdisciplinary commission. We have members from practitioner sector, as well as philanthropic and labor organizations, research institutions, corporate and financial institutions, nonprofit and community-based organizations, Hispanic serving institutions, and other colleges and university presidents. So it's a very interesting mix of backgrounds and expertise that ensures a very different kind of discourse in our deliberations, and we have a very strong orientation to action. Our job is to advise the President and the U.S. Secretary of Education on matters that pertain to educational attainment for the Hispanic communities. We've organized the commission around 3 subcommittees. One is looking at issues of early learning, and I can tell a little more later about what we're doing in each of these. The second subcommittee is the K through 12 education. And the last subcommittee is looking at post-secondary education. We've pursued similar strategies in terms of organizing community forums in which we have engagement with community members, parents, organizers, people serving in different institutions, symposia in which we commission syntheses of key topics related to each of these 3 subcommittees. And we're pursuing partnerships with different organizations that allows us to leverage resources to disseminate information. So earlier this week, I was in New York in a commission meeting in which we signed a partnership with the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, in which they're going to be supporting some of our work, as well as we've been working and collaborating with Univision to do public education outreach. This is the 25th anniversary of the initiative, and we have a number of very interesting and ambitious agenda, including commitment to action efforts from organizations in communities as well as institutions, and also an attention to what we're calling bright spots, to identify and disseminate evidence-based exemplars of practice that are showing how we can support the educational of the Hispanic community. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to elaborate later. Thank you.
Aloha, everyone. You can tell where I come from. Before I make my 5 minutes of remarks, I wanted to make sure that you hear the heart of the commission first, because you're going to hear the knowledge of the commission later. In the heart of the commission, if I can speak for my fellow commissioners, as well as the staff, is that we love connecting community to the federal government to not only hear their voices, but also fulfill their needs. So that's what drives me and my fellow colleagues who are not here today. Our president has been very clear about this place, the United States of America, as being a place that no matter what you look like, no matter where you come from, no matter what your agenda is, in fact, America forever remains a place where you can make it if you try. The president has also stated, however, that when that doesn't work for any human being, then that's when the federal government has a role. And so the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is one way of fulfilling that role. This vision shapes the work of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders because as we celebrate general trends of educational progress, we still see barriers that limit the potential of our Asian American communities and our Pacific Islanders. My fellow commissioners and our incredible staff work daily to raise awareness of these barriers in the communities where they exist, because sometimes it's even invisible there, and also to remove impediments that create disparities for Native Hawaiians, Native people, and Pacific Islanders that are out in our blue continent, and immigrants, our diverse Asian Americans. We've determined the following priority issues to address: data collection and disaggregation, access to language services and the inclusion of native language, addressing bullying and harassment in our schools, college enrollment, persistence, and graduation. These priorities cross-cut over many other issues, but these are the ones we focus on. Our work begins with addressing the collection of granular data, which for me can be boring, except for the results that it commands, and also taking that data and removing its bias. The model minority myth is alive and well due to biases that aggregated data perpetuate. And as researchers here in this conference, we know this. Aggregated data takes communities that are doing very well and mixes them with communities that are not doing well, and therefore we get a vanilla brand of results. The problem with that is it masks communities who have the largest disadvantage and need the most resources. Over the past 2 terms, our initiative has worked diligently to promote the disaggregation of Asian American and Pacific Islander data to better determine the inequities for the most disadvantaged groups. Better collection of data leads to better analysis, better policy, and better implementation, or at least we hope and drive for. A key measure on the President's college agenda calls for college completion. There are wide ranges of completion rates that would be masked if aggregated data were used. For example, there are about 20 Asian American subgroups within the major category of Asian Americans. They range in their performance on college completion. With a Bachelor of Arts degree, they range all the way from 72%, which are Asian Indian, to 12.8%, which are Laotian. And in the Pacific Islander category, there are 7 subgroups. They range in their baccalaureate degree attainment from 20.5% Native Hawaiians to 12.3% Tongans. Our initiative has recently consolidated all of the federal data pertaining to Asian American and Pacific Islanders in one central repository, which you can find on our website, that will allow researchers, nonprofits, and policymakers easy access to this data. Language has become both an asset and a barrier to educational attainment for AAPI communities. It's an asset for Native communities, where we have evidence that revitalization of Native language and culture benefits learning. And it's a barrier for many immigrant communities where limited English proficiency puts citizens at risk for their safety, access to services, and misrepresentation. Young Native people who have grown up in a world where their language and culture has been suppressed struggle in their own homelands to reconnect with their heritage of strength and leadership. Native studies show that the power of language and culture put back into our communities is closing achievement gaps. Our initiative is working with the Department of Education to explore ways to support this growth in Native language proficiency as a catalyst for learning. In AAPI communities, where 1 in 3 Asian American Pacific Islanders is limited English proficient, access to language services can make the difference between life and death. Thus, the initiative works with the federal departments to assure that information is available in all of our languages for all of the important issues that face these communities. In addition, AAPI youth find language divides them from others, resulting in slower progress in school and a catalyst for bullying. More than 1/4 of students between the ages of 12 and 18 reported being bullied at school during the 2011 school year. That's nearly 7 million students. Some Asian American and Pacific Islander students face bullying and harassment based on their immigration status. For instance, Micronesian students whose families have recently immigrated to the continent and to Hawaii are being bullied and harassed because of that. Others are bullied for the way they look, such as turban Sikh youth, or for their English language skills. In some areas, bullying of AAPI students is rampant and on the rise. For example, a 2014 study found that over 2/3 of turbaned Sikh youth in Fresno, California reported experiencing bullying and harassment. Another study found that 50% of 163 Asian American New York City public school students that were surveyed reported experiencing some kind of bias-based harassment. Finally, the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is focused on college enrollment, retention, and graduation, which are our president's priorities. Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander serving institutions, otherwise known as ANAPCs, provide a higher education gateway into low-income AAPI communities through federal grants that focus on college retention and graduation through language access, mentoring, and culture. The initiative connects these ANAPCs to grant opportunities and technical training to boost grant capacity and also student enrollment. 2/3 of the undergraduate students are concentrated in 200 of these institutions, which are encouraged to participate in opportunities that come from the federal government. Over $248 million from the Department of Education, approximately $101 million from the Department of Defense, and $60 million from the Department of Commerce. Like the President, we believe that we rise or fall together, with education being at the core of what direction we take. And as a White House Commissioner, I am proud to serve that purpose. Thank you.
Mitakiapi, Iechaya Yuha, Lila Chante, Washte Nape Chiuzapalo, Lakol Chaje Mitaki, Trawaha Chanka, Wakangle, Washichuia, Beo Mendoza, and Machiapalo. Greet you all in the Lakota language, greet you all as relatives with a heartfelt handshake. Thank you for having me here today to talk a little bit about the important work that we do under the White House Initiative on American Indian and Alaska Native Education. Since 2011, our initiative has, on behalf of the President and Secretary Duncan, as well as Secretary Jewell, who represent the Department of Education and Department of Interior, lead efforts on part of American Indian and Alaska Natives around this country. This is a relationship that's rooted in a unique political relationship, a trust responsibility, if you will, on behalf of this country as carried out through the federal government. The challenges, the opportunities as we see them are certainly expanding those outcomes, making sure we're improving on them, but simultaneously ensuring that our students, our citizens of tribal nations have the opportunities that others in this country have as well. The basis for our initiative goes back as well in history to other administrations that have valued this unique perspective to be able to address these challenges, the necessity for having this kind of vehicle in place to navigate the policy infrastructure and to ensure that our populations are reached out to and are included in all of the essential information for them to be able to expand those opportunities, improve those outcomes. And what we've done in that transition for Indian education is address decentralization. Very fragmented policy perspectives throughout history, largely 400 years, but most recently 150 years of fragmentation of Indian education policy, stemming from the brutal and destructive forces of boarding schools and what that meant for the lack of self-determination and self-governance in our educational plight, all the way to our now tribal colleges and universities and our tribal education agencies leading the way in ensuring that we are on a self-determined path and taking more of a meaningful role in the future development of our nations, if not the rebuilding. And so our role as a federal family in that regard is to withhold that responsibility, to uphold that responsibility, and to ensure that we are looking from grants, contracts, loans, and services to ask the question, what about the American Indian, the Alaska Native student, adult, nation, tribe, educational entity? And what we've heard when we talk to tribal leaders is that the vast majority of these tribal governments, these leaders who bear the responsibility of the shortcomings of other systems in this country, they say they lack a meaningful role in the education of those future generations. And so the president has heard and understood this in these communications with tribal leaders. He has prioritized Native youth in this way in the creation of this initiative. And when he visited in June of this year, 2014 here, to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, he was tremendously struck by what he heard from those youth. Not only the challenges, the despair, the seemingly deep and pervasive sense of hopelessness, but just an unwavering sense of resilience and being able to overcome those obstacles no matter what. And so in our daily work, that is at the root of what we do to address challenges like, as I mentioned, the lack of tribal control, the rural nature of our work. 33 states have one tribe or more in this country. There are approximately 5.2 million of us that identify as American Indian, Alaska Native, and an additional race. About 4.9 million that identify as just American Indian or Alaska Native alone. The tremendous diversity that we share with our Asian American and Pacific Islander brethren, if you will, is also reflected in my work. I often get to tell my colleagues at the Department of Education and other federal agencies the 50 states that they have to work with is certainly challenging, and I respect that. I have to work in the world of 566 different tribes and over 300 languages. And so this kind of diversity necessitates flexibility, necessitates, as Secretary Duncan says, being focused on the goals, but flexible on the means to achieve those goals. And all too often throughout history, they've been prescribed and not brought to the local level. So we have a lot of specific initiatives that we work on in this area to address these issues. The Generation Indigenous Initiative, certainly My Brother's Keeper is important to that work, and we worked hard to strengthen state and tribal relationships. At the core of this is, of course, the experiences of our Native youth. And just like bullying and school discipline, the miseducation, the misrepresentation and information of our Native students is epitomized by such things as school mascots and our professional team mascots. I couldn't come to Chicago and not address the vulgar name that represents the hockey team of this city or the football team of the city that I lay residence to, and the challenges and harm that places on our students. And so that's a little bit about our initiative, and I look forward to the dialogue about more of the specifics that we're trying to do in this area. Thank you.
Good morning. All right. My name is Ivory Tosin. I'm the current Deputy Director of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. I was appointed to this position by President Obama in September of 2013. Our current Executive Director is Dr. George Cooper. And we are the oldest of the White House initiatives. We were started under President Carter. And the purpose of our initiative is to expand federal support to HBCUs. So there's a lot of streams of revenue that comes from the federal government to HBCUs through various programs such as Title III, Title IV, and competitive grants and contracts across about 32 federal agencies. And it's our job to facilitate any process that keeps that revenue moving in the right direction and interfere with any process that may jeopardize that funding. There are currently about 107 HBCUs. About 100 are eligible for federal support. It's a very diverse sector of institutions that have varying ranges of Carnegie classifications. There are 2 HBCUs that have a Carnegie classification of very high research activity, and that's Howard University and Jackson State University. We also have a lot of teaching colleges, and a lot of HBCUs have had tremendous success in producing graduates that go on to get their PhDs in STEM. In fact, if you look at the top 50 colleges across the nation that produce graduates that go on to get a PhD in STEM, 21 of the 50 are historically black colleges and universities. One of the main tasks that we have is to coordinate with federal agencies, including the Department of Education, which we're housed in, to help them to understand the value of HBCUs and to provide mechanisms by which HBCUs can fairly compete for federal dollars. We have a HBCU liaison in every federal agency, and their job is to give us the information to help us understand the trends associated with their giving to HBCUs. It helps us to understand how much they're given to all institutions of higher education and what percent is coming back to HBCUs. They also have the job of identifying ways in which HBCUs may be an underutilized resource within their agency. So they may have a grant program that focuses on disadvantaged students, quote-unquote disadvantaged students, yet they are not tapping into the expertise of HBCUs who have been leading that work for over a century. It's also their job, in coordination with us, to encourage private sector partnerships with HBCUs and to help HBCUs to improve their overall capacity. So we offer things like technical assistance and articles that help HBCUs to navigate some of these very large federal agencies so that they could find the resources that they need to construct their agenda in the most meaningful and effective way. Under Dr. Cooper and my leadership, there are several things that we implemented within our initiative. One is a federal compendium that looks at grant programs that's been awarded to HBCUs. So what we wanted to do was to help HBCUs to learn from each other. So we put out a call for any HBCU that's gotten funding from the federal government to talk about the program that they got funding for so that all HBCUs would be able to benefit from the success of others. We also implemented what we call the HBCU All-Star Program, where we put out a call to all 100 HBCUs to designate or to nominate someone that would serve as an ambassador between their HBCU and our initiative. We got over 700 applications for that, and we selected 75 students across the nation. And it's been a very rewarding program because in prior years we've had most of our emphasis on the presidents and the executive staff. But now we have students at these colleges that we can go to if we want to get messages directly to the students. And in fact, some of the times we have to go through the students to get information to the president. So they've been a very valuable part of our program. We also have something called the HBCU Dashboard, which looks at indicators of success across various domains, looking within the sector of HBCUs rather than comparing HBCUs to predominantly white institutions. One of the things in which, one of the mechanisms by which HBCUs have been unfairly characterized in the media is by taking all 100 HBCUs and comparing them to all predominantly white institutions. And when you look at things in that terms, you tend to disguise a lot of the nuanced factors that can be associated with one number. And we also, and it also serves to disguise some of the success that's happening at HBCU. So what the dashboard does is it looks at various indicators such as their enrollment trends, the revenue that they're bringing in, their competitiveness with getting grants and contracts, the turnover of leadership, and a lot of other factors to help us understand where HBCUs are successful. This September, we're going to have the HBCU Week Conference. We typically have about 1,200 people that come to that conference. Most of the presidents are represented, just about all of the HBCUs are represented, and we bring bring them all together so they could understand how to more effectively use our initiative to tap into the resources of the federal government so that they learn from each other, and also to broker some of the private sector partnerships that's defined in our executive order. So I look forward to the dialogue through this town hall, and thanks for listening.
Good morning. This is a very significant session in the history of AERA, highlighting the White House initiatives, for those groups that have been historically marginalized, and making connections, explicit connections to the education research community cannot be underestimated. And I want to thank President Joyce King and the AERA Planning Committee for pulling together such an important and significant session. I have a comment toward the end of my notes here that will kind of help us challenge and take advantage of this particular historic moment. I'm not going to belabor you with kind of a long discussing comments, but I want to start the interactive conversation that we'll have, and we have a wonderful opportunity to speak with the commissioners who are here. But in my effort to think sort of more broadly about the initiatives and looking for common themes and also differences, I'm going to introduce at least initial questions for the commissioners that may be helpful in advancing our interactive conversation. I was very pleased to see there's a natural connection between education researchers and the initiatives. Many of the commissioners, some of the commissioners, are members of the education research community and very distinguished scholars and researchers across the country, and some of them are on the panel. And it's clear, based on the presentations that were given, brief presentations that have been given, that the initiatives are taking very seriously this idea of disseminating information about the work that they're doing. But there's a larger research and evaluation question that I would like to beg, having to do with how the initiatives are assessing how well that they are doing given the objectives that have been stated by the executive orders and their missions. If you read the executive orders and how the initiatives are doing their work, a lot of their goals are very ambitious and connect with advancement of the society generally, and particularly about educating these marginalized historic groups. So it would be curious to get a sense about how well they think they are doing given these objectives. Also, I think President Joyce King would appreciate my next question. It has to do with, I'm assuming there's an assumption in the work of the initiatives about the kind of cultural identity and maintenance for the marginalized groups that they represent. One of the initiatives, in particular, the American Indian Alaska Native Education Initiative, has an explicit goal of maintaining kind of and protection of culture and cultural identity, as well as self-determination. My assumption is that the other initiatives also embrace these cultural identity outcomes, even though they are not as explicit. So one question would be, is my assumption correct? And that may actually lead to some interesting discussion. I'm assuming I'm gonna say that it's correct. It's just not explicit in the material and information that's disseminated by the initiatives. Across all the initiatives, one of the major objectives is to increase interagency cooperation and collaboration within sort of various federal agencies in Washington. And this is critically important given the goals and objectives of the initiatives. Connected to that sort of broader theme of agency cooperation and collaboration, a question is being begged here, an obvious one is, I wonder how well the initiatives collaborate and cooperate, given that they have some similar objectives they're trying to meet for their constituencies. It's clear that initiatives have embraced kind of other sort of broader federal initiatives like My Brother's Keeper, but I'd be curious to note, are there collaborative efforts, given that this is sort of one sort of larger federal initiative, are there collaborative efforts across initiatives to kind of meet the sort of broader goals of My Brother's Keeper or other kinds of pressing federal policy issues? And to my last comment, which is connected, is that this effort, this sort of beautiful and important tapestry of this work across initiatives, positioned the initiatives in the best place to provide an immense collective impact for the educating the children of the United States. And I would sort of encourage even more sort of dialogue, connection between the initiatives, and to kind of hold dear kind of this broader collective impact. I said that would be my last comment, but this would be my last comment. Because this is the one that I'm most familiar with. And I'm going to just leave my comments about the bookends of the initiatives, the first initiative and the last initiative. As you know, the first initiative is on the historically black colleges, and the last initiative being on educational excellence for African Americans. So between those two bookends came the other initiatives. And there's something interesting and special about the new kid on the block. Yes, I think they've learned some lessons. Hopefully they've learned some lessons. I'd be curious about that. But in reading and kind of and looking at themes that emerge from how they do their work, how they describe, this initiative sort of describes itself, it seems to be more, even more, some my friends would say, to more politically kind of savvy and coherent to kind of larger federal policies. My critical friends would be more critical of that. So I'll be interesting to kind of hear a response about that. Also, I have, I told one of my colleagues that I'm doing, providing a discussion comments on that. So I suppose to push the new initiative on educational excellence of African Americans and ask about their focus on and attention to the higher education experiences of African Americans that are not in historically black colleges, because you have a new agenda about higher education, post-secondary learning and outcomes. So the attention to that is critically important. So I look forward to kind of this broader engaging conversation with the commissioners as well as with the audience. Thank you very much.
Hi again. So I get the pleasure of making the comment of emphasizing the fact that this is a town hall, and here I stand between the end of the panel and the Q&A portion of this. 3 really quick comments that I want to make. The first is to offer just a bit of context. The office that I lead in the Department of Education delivers more than half of all of the grant programs out of the Department of Education, close to $3 billion annually. And it's quite significant, not just because of the dollar amount, but if you add up the investment of our philanthropic partners, Lumina, Gates, Kresge, Ford, you all know the powers that be. Those investments, at least in the post-secondary space, are roughly $700 million. So the fact that the department is committed to delivering such a sizable investment in the post-secondary space, at least, is important, not just because of the dollar amount. When you look at the portfolio, $850 million annually for TRIO programs, more than $330 million for Gear Up, Title III programs that support HBCUs and others, Title V HSIs. 75 to 80% of that portfolio is singularly focused on improving the educational outcomes of low-income first-generation students, which happen to be majority students of color. And it's a significant investment in improving the educational outcomes. And that portfolio is serving students from middle school all the way through doctoral programs with McNair. So in the context of talking about the initiatives, the department also has a pretty sizable grant-making machine to support the work that's happening on the ground. Point number 2 is really one that's relevant to this community, and that is how do we more effectively leverage educational research to improve the effectiveness of our programs on the ground. I actually think, and I'll stay in the post-secondary realm, that the critical questions that we all sort of wonder about as they relate to student success and degree completion, that the social science lags behind the questions. The educational research lags behind the questions. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about how students use financial aid, it doesn't matter if we're talking about how they progress through developmental education courses. There are any host of issues that are related to degree completion and student success that our science sort of lags behind the critical questions. Third point I want to make is how do we more effectively place educational research in public policy settings? It's very interesting when you think about the sort of concept of public policy. It really is concerned with advancing public policy for the masses. Educational researchers are generally trained to focus very narrowly on specific populations, specific social issues, specific social phenomenon or educational phenomenon, and there's really sort of a tension there. For years, Linda Tillman, we've been talking about how the research that we all do can be more relevant in policy sectors, but the question is, how do you really place it in those spaces? The second issue there is, can we develop as a community? I'd be interested to hear from the panel sort of to tell this community what kind of information, data, research analysis is needed to actually advance some key policy initiatives that are taking place across the country, and whether or not they constitute what I call actionable intelligence. So when the study is produced, can we actually use it in a way? Is it timely? Is it appropriately focused so that it's digestible and useful, that it constitutes actionable intelligence as it relates to policy? The third point I'll just make in terms of placing public policy research is this matter of relevance, and whether or not there's a tension between researchers in the research community who are concerned about the research that matters to them as an individual scholar, and that's what makes it relevant because it's important to me, or is it relevant because it's targeted at informing key critical issues in the educational space? And I think it's something that we have to reconcile in the community. I've gone to a few sessions over the last couple of days, and it's something that I sort of leave wondering is this relevant? Is it relevant because the scholar thinks that studying left-handed, third-generation LGBT students and their sense of belongingness on a campus is relevant, or sort of can I attach it to the policy questions of the day? And that's not to offend anybody's personal research. I'm a former faculty member myself, and so I believe in academic freedom, but the question is, given the tens and thousands of people who descend on Chicago and New York and all of the places that AERA meets, how useful, how relevant is the body of research produced by this community in advancing the issues that you heard from the panelists today? So I'll conclude there. Thank you for your time, and Linda, you'll moderate the balance of our session.
So at this point, we would like to have you come forward and make a comment or a question, because we anticipate we'll have a lot of people who want to ask questions. And please direct your comment or question to a specific commissioner or discussant. So we already have, some really valuable information, and I would agree with James's last point about, this is a discussion we've been having forever, how relevant is the research to the actual programs, or is it just for me as an individual if I choose to use it? So I think that's Tandika, are you?
It is. So first, I do want to thank you all for having this panel. I think it's been very informative. And as both an educator and a researcher, I use a lot of the work that's actually put up by the dashboards to communicate those types of understandings to both my students and the larger public. I really would actually be interested in hearing your response to quite a few of Professor Davis's questions about the way that the commissions work across each other, as well as how you measure your outcomes. My question is, could you take us somewhat through the process? Like, what happens once the commission has found something, or when you know something is incredibly wrong and not working? Is there a process when that goes to the president, and does that actual information have any weight? So, for example, and I'm trying to make sure that I stay on task because I don't want to have to arm wrestle Dr. Miner in the hallway, as he suggested, if I go off task. But for example, the over-representation of African American and Latino students in charter schools that are currently failing or at the same rate of academic outcomes as their traditional public school peers. And knowing that type of information through the different commissions, do you then take that information and call for some changes within the Obama administration on charter school reform, or is that just information that you then collect and it becomes a suggested topic?
Anybody want to speak to that?
Hi, my name's Chrissy.
We want to get
Oh, sorry.
answer.
I thought we were logging them all.
I can start.
Okay.
Good question, and I can give you a good example about charter schools. It may not be the example that you were thinking about, but it's one that's near and dear to my heart. So the issue is charter schools, and it comes from Native peoples, and in my case it comes from Hawaii, where their charter schools have been started with language and culture at their center. So these are community started, they're not market-driven charter schools. And the Secretary of Education has been to Hawaii twice to listen to the stories of achievement, to also demand and command that we show our performance around it. But today we sit in discussions, and in May, the middle of May, we'll also bring to the table the request to change whatever tests we come up with that we think are appropriate in our own native tongue. And so that's an example of something that Secretary Duncan has taken to heart. He has asked us questions and asked us for information about it, and we will be having concrete discussions with him about what that looks like and how it will be implemented. So there's an example of word to government and then government responding to need.
Mr. Mendoza.
I just want to speak to the question of the collaborations. I think one of the certainly most recent collaborations has been the initiatives work on the My Brother's Keeper initiative, and how we've kind of sequenced our outreach and engagement, and certainly doing what we can in our respective roles, as Dr. Toldson and others spoke to, on how we drive this work within the federal agencies. Literally each one of our initiatives has those liaisons specific to our communities, so it's a giant effort for us to keep one another on the same page at the various levels, and more often than not, we each have critical pieces of information that, when exchanged, creates that real nexus of activity that ensures our unique and different populations are accounted for. One of the other specific tangibles has been our long-standing work around minority-serving institutions, specifically how we're thinking in that comprehensive lens beyond the vanguards of these initiatives, such as the historically black colleges and the tribal colleges and universities of this country, to thinking of the predominantly black institutions and the native serving institutions. And for when we came into this administration, when the president came in, those processes were separate and disconnected from one another. And so the first course of action for the initiatives was to sequence those as well, to bring them into alignment with one another, and to share our practices with one another on how we are standing up working groups to drive the goals and objectives and plans that these agencies put forth to implement our executive orders. And so that process is in place, but again, it's, takes a long time to turn the barge of the federal government in a concrete direction, and one of the toughest places is that area of collaboration for us. Just getting us all on the same panel was a gargantuan effort in and of itself, but we continue to look for these opportunities. We work on a daily, if not intensive basis, keeping one another abreast of the issues and challenges that we face for one another, and so in that way we have all our bases covered.
Alfredo.
Thank you for the question. In terms of our Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics, we're also acutely aware of the need to keep an eye across multiple sectors beyond education. So we understand that we're dealing with social issues that need to be coordinated with education. And there is a federal interagency working group that is focusing on issues of educational excellence for Hispanics that was created about a year or so ago, that is communicating on a systematic basis about different opportunities and resources that can be made available to the Hispanic community in a number of different areas, such as employment, as well as professional development opportunities and grants and opportunities to advance people's careers that will be applicable and of interest to the Hispanic community. There is also emerging discussions about how to reconfigure and articulate data collection efforts through OCR so that we can begin to disaggregate some of the issues in terms of access to educational opportunities, such as charter schools versus non-charter schools, in terms of placement of Latino, Hispanic students in special education and so forth. Ways of really beginning to get at the nuanced aspects that affect access and opportunity for students of Latino and other minority backgrounds. So those are examples of things that we're trying to pursue in terms of coordinating efforts, in terms of also the movement of the work of the Commission through the federal structure. We have an initiative to recognize exemplary Latino teachers. There was a call about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, to identify teachers of Latino heritage working in very different institutional settings around the country. There was a process of nomination and a review process that was led by Commissioner Patricia Gandara and a subgroup of commissioners. These folks were identified, they were vetted, there was a number of procedures in place to recognize the importance of recruiting more Latino teachers to work with the Latino community, Hispanic community. They received an award. The White House was directly involved in this, as well as the U.S. Department of Education. But that's something in which we are very committed. We'll continue to do that, to call attention to the urgent need to recruit more Latino and Latina teachers to work with the Hispanic community. We are expanding that conversation. We are in the early stages of doing that, to include attention to leadership issues and Latina leaders, because it's critical to also consider this issue of Latino beyond the classroom level to the building level and the district level. So those are examples of things that are happening.
Thank you. Next question. I can't see it. Lights in my face.
Hi, my question's for the entire panel. I heard a lot of discussion from you all about the assets and opportunities in each of the communities you represent, as well as some of the barriers that are faced. And I'm wondering what each of your initiatives are doing to sort of reframe some of the national dialogue that we've had with a really deficit-based language approach in the communities, and shifting that to more of an asset and honoring of language that you spoke about.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. So our executive director, David Johns and the chair of the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans, Dr. Freeman Rabowski, are adamant about using our opportunity and platform to ensure that we are able to disrupt narratives of deficit. I would even also, in response to the last question, challenge everyone to consider how academia can use race consciousness more efficiently and effectively in the research being conducted, even to the extent that it may not be explicitly clear that race matters, so that we have the tools to not fight about whether charters or not charters or unions or not unions, but actually what are we doing on the ground to ensure that every child, regardless of their zip code or genetic code, has access to a high quality education. And so every time we are out in communities and hosting summits around the country, our initiative explicitly is ready and willing to challenge even invited guests and panelists to panels we may be moderating or hosting when they say things like these kids or those families, right? Because I want to know which kids and which families are you talking about, because my children are in school with their pants sagging, but did you notice they were in school, right? The conversation around grit and rigor that has some implicit biases embedded in it. You know, I've said before that our children have, or our people have made it through the diaspora, and I think we have a lot of grit and resilience from the moment we are born into this country. And so if that's not enough to show that we are ready and willing and that parents are ready and willing for their children to have high quality education, I'm not sure what else you're asking of us. And so it's important for academics, again, to ensure that they are supporting us with research about more granular practices that they're seeing. So it's great that you have a particular research focus, but how can you use that, apply race consciousness when you didn't think you needed to your research, and provide us with some examples of how communities and educators are being thoughtful about practices that rely on the assets of the children in front of them, the assets of the families that they're connecting with. It is readily available, it is in front of us, but do we as academics consider ourselves responsible for looking to the assets for the questions that we raise in our research, as opposed to trying to figure out a deficit when the deficit may come from a bias that we have within ourselves?
Ivory has a comment as well.
Yeah, just quickly, because it's been adequately addressed, but I want to first thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question to have in this space, which is a community of researchers. The Obama administration has been very deliberate about trying to frame the problems in a way that respects the assets of our communities. In fact, when I was selected, it was because of the work that I had done on anti-deficit research and some of the quote-unquote myth-busting stuff that attracted them to me. So we all make it a practice to highlight the strengths of the community and to show the problems in a way that really shows how structural issues are contributing to those problems. What I would say to educational researchers is that most of the ways in which people in general talk about these issues is because of the way that we have laid out the research. And too many times we have sensationalized communities in ways that have made them subject to a lot of stereotype threat. And so as an academic researcher before taking this position, I was always mindful of that. And being on the other side, being with policy, I see how some of our most prominent voices are putting information out there that can influence some people working in policy to think that certain communities are just doomed to failure. So we do have to structure all of our research in ways that highlights those strengths. The one specific suggestion I would make is that our use of comparative research, so if, to compare black students to white students, that is insufficient research.
Right.
White people should not be used as a comparative group to any other community, because it makes the assumption that that community needs to be more like white people in order to do better. Right. What that community needs is to be more like the best in their community.
Right. Thank you.
Real quickly, I'm just glad I didn't use any of my white people stats. Otherwise, it would have shamed me. No, but it's a tough issue. I mean, I think back a little over a couple months ago now when we released the adjusted cohort graduation rates, and we saw gains for American Indian and Alaska Natives in that analysis. It was tough for our community. There were national thought leaders that didn't want to have that conversation of any demonstrated progress among our population because of the fact that we face a tremendous plight in just addressing the data quality issues for where we are experiencing overrepresentation or underrepresentation, whatever that measure might be. And so it just continues to be a challenging issue for creating value in everything that Khalil and Ivory talked about in getting that to come to some level of understanding and policy. And every time we release a report, it comes under that critique that it was either not addressing the challenges in a strong enough way, or we skirted the issue in trying to talk about the assets part of what we deal with in our communities particular. So I just wanted to acknowledge that point too, that it is a tough issue by community.
Next question.
Hi, so I have one question and one comment. The question is, all these initiatives are very awesome, and how is that dialogue merged into the ESEA reauthorization? Because we all know that from the research, if it's not part of the accountability, then it's always going to be the last priority for school to implement this. So how are these conversations are going to happen in this reauthorization? So that's one of my questions. That's my question. And my comment is go towards earlier there was you were saying that went to several research and talking about are these research are relevant. So I'm a second-year doctoral student, and my comment, and I want to push back a little bit for that, is all the research are relevant to this. It is just like, how are you gonna see all the qualitative and quantitative research as a political, as a politics perspective? So it's just, it's a little bit disappointing to hear that, and I really appreciate if you can also just see all the qualitative, quantitative mixed methods are as value as everything else. So thank you so much.
Anybody want to start out? So her question was about how are the agencies working or impacting the reauthorizations.
Yeah, there's not a lot to say about that. It's the reauthorization of ESEA is a very convoluted process, for lack of a better word. Members of Congress will need to take the lead on drafting the language and the legislation. All of us have some role in communicating with members of Congress and people within the administration. And there's a lot of people that have to come to an agreement. I think that there's a lot of diversity within the federal government. There's a lot of people who believe different ways. Some of them have been elected, some of them have been appointed, some of them are career. And we're all going to have to come together, and we're going to have to rely on you all, the educational experts, to help us to come up with something that's going to be good for the future of for all of us. So I'm just addressing the first part of the question.
So maybe I'll address the second part, and because I didn't come to disappoint, I want to recast this issue of relevance, and I think the question is not really whether or not all research is relevant. The question is relevant to whom and to what. And that's the question. So as now a person in a public policy capacity, I can tell you any number of sessions that I've sat in Division J and as they're related to post-secondary education. And I have to ask the question, is the research that's being presented in this session more relevant to the researcher, or is it more relevant to what I might call sort of high priority public policy issues of the day? And that's really the question, and I think to Linda's point, this is a question that a lot of research communities have been struggling with for a long time. So it's not that it's irrelevant, it's relevant to somebody. My question is, how useful is it to people who are in public policy spaces to advance the work that they have to do? So I hope one of the things that this panel and the individuals representing the White House initiatives will tell you is the kind of research, evidence, qualitative or quantitative, that's helpful or relevant to them and can be consumed as actionable intelligence, either at a national level, at a state level, or locally, to advance critical policy issues.
Good morning. Thank you for your leadership on these issues, and thank you for the conversation today. I'm going to ask if folks would expand a little bit on some of the responses that they've just given, particularly with respect to how ableism and whiteness come together in schools to provide the logic, the acceptable logic to the majority population for segregating practices. As one example, in efforts to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline, for example, folks may be, leaders may be picking up positive behavioral interventions and supports as a mediating effort, and yet in many ways, because the standards for conduct are white standards for conduct, we wind up switching one deficit identity of a bad kid for another deficit identity of the sick kid, right? So I would ask if the commissioners could please respond to how their areas of, the committees, the initiatives they're working on would address these types of dynamics as they're enshrined in IDEA and its attendant practices.
Sure, I'd like to jump in here. Our initiative does a great deal of work around working with communities and working with youth advocates who are interested in disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. And when you talk about that intersection of ableism and whiteness, oftentimes we like to push on folk who want to propose strategies that are seeking to fix children, right? Not accepting the children who come to school ready to learn. And so when we are thinking through practices and policies that are targeted at reducing disparities, it's not the federal government's job to tell communities what they should do. I think you've heard across all of the presenters the term self-determination and deciding what's right for their own communities. And so if you have policies or practices that are centered in ableism or centered in whiteness being rightness, it is very easy to see how young people are castigated or determined to be in need of fixing. You know, we have to be very deliberate about our language, as the other young lady asked about, you know, how do we approach solutions from an asset base versus a deficit base. And when you start the conversation by saying, we are here to support at-risk youth, as if they woke up with a title of at risk and not waking up as children, the strategies you're gonna apply inherently are going to propose to fix them, as opposed to seeing what they bring to the table and why they should be valued in the schoolhouse, why they should be valued in community, why they should be valued at the collegiate level, why they should still be valued if they are incarcerated. So the work that we do, we bring people together. We've had several roundtables. We had a recent roundtable or symposium at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where we brought in different stakeholders from schools of social work, intervention programs, prevention programs, also young people who were on the panel as per our usual, to talk about ways that students who have been in justice settings can have high quality education, and also weigh in on how they should not have ended up in the school-to-prison pipeline. What factors have happened across the school that push them into that situation? So ableism and whiteness are certainly considerations, but primarily they should be considerations for able people and white people. It is not the job of people who are being oppressed to fix issues that they didn't bring to this continent. So, We like to bring, again, people who are in lived experience to the table to talk about how they've been treated, to talk about what solutions they like to see, to talk about how to feel loved when they show up at school, whether or not they manifest in the way that able people do. And so it's important for us who know better to do reality check and privilege checks of ourselves. And so we try to encourage that conversation through our initiative and through partnering with other agencies and departments across the federal government to be very thoughtful about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go higher versus in the granular. But I learned something valuable yesterday that sort of helped me to understand what I was, getting indigestion about. And that is that there was a discussion about the different kinds of research. And at the end of that discussion yesterday, the question was, why aren't we doing more research at the community level? And the answer was, well, that would be a good thing to do, but we can't bring the rigor that we would need as researchers to that level. And then there was some debate about that. But what came out of it was the reality, and I think this addresses the whole issue of whites versus color versus all of the national statistics. When you go to the community level, there is less chance of those kinds of grand comparisons being made because you are dealing in your neighborhoods. And so your community is as diverse as it is. And when you bring community citizens to the table and talk about the issues of that community, you find that there is appropriate comparisons being made in that community. And so my challenge to research, going back up, is to figure out ways to take what's going on in communities, because communities are dynamic. They are connecting every day. They are evolving. And find out what's working there and give those communities assistance with the rigor that's needed in order to show that what they're doing is actually making a difference. But find ways to take it there, because our world is far more complex today than it used to be.
And next question.
Good morning. My question, I believe, should go to Commissioner Harris. In my school district, which is a public school district, we happen to have a program entitled an African-Centered Curriculum Program. And really serendipitously with the last comment, I'm wondering how might we get some assistance in creating a clarifying of the research question that this program might be answering so that it can kind of inform the dialogue and inform the decision makers who are making decisions about whether or not or how the program would continue.
Thank you for your question. That's a good question. Well, first let me say that I'm also a doctoral student, and my research is centered in who gets a seat at the table for education reform and education policy making. And what I offer to you is that you don't have to wait on the federal government to have research done and amplify a strategy that you believe is effective for your community. All too often, I think people are waiting for someone to bring an issue to the federal government as a solution. And what I would offer you is that if you can organize a community summit yourselves around African-centered curriculum and invite stakeholders to the table, invite researchers to the table to cultivate their interest in it, that's a great way for it to rise up from the community to the federal government. I made a comment to Secretary Duncan a couple of weeks ago about the Whitney Young syndrome, right, where Whitney Young was put on every presidential commission as the representative of the black voice. And so people would say, have you engaged the black community? And they say, Whitney Young is sitting right here. He told us what the black community feels. And I said, we have to do a better job, even as a department, of hearing from organizations like the Urban League and the NAACP, but also your Dignity in Schools, or your Philly Power United, or other organizations that are doing work on the ground, Journey for Justice, and bring all of those voices together so that we can hear about communities that say we have been implementing African-centered curriculum And here are the results that we've been seeing. And so maybe the department can partner with you and say, well, we have some researchers who have been interested in looking at other strategies that might be able to support you with evaluation, so that you can say what success looks like. The gentleman talked about ableism and whiteness, so that you can say what success for your community looks like, right? Then you don't get into, well, did it cause students to get 5 more points on a standardized test? Right? Did it cause students to be able to pass the SAT doing African-centered curriculum? Well, what it actually did was it met the values our community has determined for itself, shows excellence, and here's how it did that. And we'd like to have it amplified. And so now, Department of Education, we are hosting a summit. Will you come and see what we have learned from this work? Does that answer your question? Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And Dr. Artelis would like to make
Very
a
quickly,
comment.
I want to share that our commission also is very committed to engage and document what's happening in communities through a number of initiatives. As part of the 25th anniversary of the commission, we're pursuing a couple of things I want to share with you. One is what we're calling commitments to action that will bring together organizations from the public and private sector, or within each of those, to invest in programs and in strategies that will aim to increase educational outcomes, in this case for Hispanic students. But the idea is to generate enough interest and leverage resources to benefit from those efforts that are taking place at the ground level, that are committed to systematic collection of evidence that will show results that in turn might even generate new programs of research at different levels, state and federal, for example. The other one is bright spots. We're trying to collect information about evidence-based programs that are showing results, positive results for the Hispanic communities. They can be models, they can be organizations or initiatives. The idea is that we can take those bright spots first to let everybody else know about this, but also to help us invest in those priorities that are coming out of those strategies. And more importantly, to begin to ask questions, how do we encourage collaboration between this bright spot that is taking place here with other things that may be happening at the regional or national level? So I think those are examples of the kinds of empowerment and commitment to action that we are definitely endorsing, that I think reflect our commitment to have an asset-based approach that was raised before. I think it cuts across all the commissions.
So we have time for one more question before we have to leave the room.
Good morning. My name is Tanya Miles. I'm a member of the National Assessment Governing Board. We set policy for NAEP. And since 2009, well, I've been on the board since 2009. Since 2010, we really picked up on a challenge from Secretary Duncan, and that is how do we engage parents in student achievement, increasing it, and also in helping to close gaps. Working within a congressional mandate for what we do with NAEP as policymakers, we can get the data to you. We can show you the reports. We can bring you to the reports. But with NAEP parent engagement, we've really embraced that since 2010. We're trying to say, how do we show our parents, parent leaders, the data that is there for NAEP? How can we show them how best to see student achievement, to see differences in student achievement, to really go beyond the reports so that they can engage in productive, positive conversations with their teachers, principals, leaders, or legislators. So with respect to your different roles, I would invite you to look at the NAGB.org website and the parent pages. And also I'm looking for, I guess, maybe partnerships or collaborations that you've done with parents in helping them to get involved in this whole idea with helping to improve student achievement for the U.S.
Anybody? Did you want a response to that, or that was just a comment?
It's more of a comment, but I think the response, maybe with respect to time, I'll try to get individually.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, at least from the standpoint of the American Indian Alaska Native Initiative, we've been really working hard to develop, kind of utilizing the access that we have to all of the thousands of grantees across the country in trying to set up communities of practice there in kind of national networks of individuals and organizations that further support that effort. And I think we need to have more specific conversations with folks at AERA around how we are actually working together in that respect. I know one of the challenges that we always hear from not only tribal leaders, educators, and tribal communities just across the board, whether you're talking about parents and students, is that they rarely see themselves in the statistic that's being reported. They're only ever just an asterisk, or there is not enough information available to be able to speak to their circumstances there. And so that challenge is, to back on the researchers. What if it's not there, articulate direction beyond that, work with others to fill in those gaps. I think that's one of the key things that we've been focusing on, both with programs where we know we're trying to provide for flexibility, but then still strengthening program performance, in the entirety of the grants. It still continues to be a challenge for us, but there are ways, and I think Ms. Harris spoke to this, how it relates to the community on a direct level for them being meaningfully involved. We lack in tribal communities many of those principal investigators, but partnering meaningfully with those tribal communities to get at the issues that they prioritize is huge. And we rarely see those reported in not only the application for resources, but the products of those reports. And like you said, the reports of themselves, the research is not change in and of itself, but how do we get those to the communities? And I think us working together, the trusted perspective that we have and the near peer relationships that we have in place could get us to that effect quicker.
If I can jump in really quickly, I also want to say, the young lady mentioned achievement gaps, and it's important for us to have data that's supporting how we disrupt gaps in opportunity. Because if you're just looking at statistics that are based on measures of achievement that are already problematic and position African American children in a way that they will always look like they are failing against some nefarious standard that was not created by their community, you can bring as much data as you want to the table, but the point in sharing that with communities where, while they're not an asterisk, they are actually explicitly named in the data, but named in the data as problematic. And so if you are trying to work with families, it is important to put data in context and to begin by asking them what they are hoping to resolve in their community and what success looks like in their community. So that was an excellent point, and I think we do have to do a better job of figuring out how we bridge that connection with researchers who have data, especially data that can be supportive of communities, but it's also important that we're thoughtful about how we present that data and are sharing that data such that we are not using data to say, look how bad your community is, what do you want to do about it? And start with the question of, tell me what you want to see for your children, and let's make sure we have some data points that can help you come up with a resolution that is based on your values.
We'd like to thank you for attending this session. We're out of time. If you would give our panelists a hand, they'll be available for some additional questions. Thank you.